I didn't realize how little I mattered to my parents until the day they told me I was too self-sufficient to worry about. They said it casually, like it was a compliment, like it explained everything. I was 28 at the time, sitting at the small kitchen table in the house I grew up in, watching my mother slide a stack of papers toward my sister while my dad nodded approvingly. That was the day they signed the family property over to her. Not because she earned it, not because she needed it more, but because, according to them, I'd be fine no matter what. My name is Elvis. I'm 34 now, and this is the story of how being reliable quietly made me disposable. Growing up, I was the easy one. The kid who didn't cause problems, didn't need reminders, didn't ask for much. If something needed fixing, I figured it out. If money was tight, I took extra shifts. If plans fell apart, I adjusted. My parents used to joke that I came out of the womb with a checklist. My sister, Marissa, was the opposite. She was emotional, impulsive, always in some kind of crisis that required immediate attention. Late rent, dropped classes, another relationship that ended badly, another big idea that needed funding. My parents hovered around her like she was fragile glass, while I learned early that praise was something you got for not needing help. By my early 20s, the pattern was obvious. When Marissa needed something, the family rearranged itself. When I needed something, I was told I'd figure it out. And I did. I moved out early, worked my way up in a logistics firm, paid my own tuition part-time, built savings. I showed up to every holiday, every birthday, every last-minute favor. I drove my dad to appointments when his knee started acting up. I fixed the leaking roof on weekends. I handled paperwork they didn't want to deal with. I thought that counted for something. The property was always this unspoken thing hanging in the background. A modest but valuable piece of land with the old family house on it, fully paid off, passed down from my grandparents. My parents talked about it like it was sacred. One day, this will keep the family secure, my dad used to say. I assumed that meant it would be handled responsibly. Maybe split, maybe sold and divided, maybe kept as a safety net for everyone. I never imagined I'd be sitting at that table watching it be handed over like a consolation prize. They didn't even frame it as a discussion. My mom cleared her throat and said they'd been thinking about the future. My dad said Marissa needed stability. Then came the line I still hear in my head. You're strong, Elvis. You don't need a safety net. Your sister does. I remember looking at the papers, at Marissa's signature line already filled out, and feeling something quietly crack. Not rage, not shock, just this slow, sinking realization that my role had already been decided, and no one thought to ask how I felt about it. Marissa avoided my eyes the whole time. She kept talking about plans, renovations, turning part of the house into a rental, using the equity to start a business. My parents nodded like proud investors. I asked one question carefully about loans, about debt, about what would happen if things didn't work out. My dad smiled and said I worried too much. My mom said we had to trust family. Then she added, almost kindly, you've always landed on your feet. We know you'll be okay. I drove home that night in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't make it a scene. That's the part people always expect, the big confrontation. But something about being told you don't matter because you're competent takes the wind out of you. It turns anger inward. It makes you wonder when exactly being dependable stopped being a virtue and started being an excuse to overlook you. Over the next few years, the distance grew. Marissa took out loan after loan against the property. Every time she called, it was to talk about the next big thing, the next expansion, the next temporary setback. My parents backed her every time. When I cautioned them, gently, they accused me of being negative. When I offered to look over contracts, they said Marissa had it handled. When I stopped offering, no one noticed. Meanwhile, my own life kept moving. Promotions, relocations, long hours that paid off. I bought my own place without telling them until after the papers were signed. My mom said she was proud, but there was something flat in her voice, like my achievements were expected, not celebrated. My dad joked that I didn't need them anymore. I laughed along, because that's what I'd always done. The first real crack came when Marissa missed a loan payment. Then another. Suddenly, family dinners included tense whispers and phone calls taken in the other room. My parents started asking me questions again. What did I think they should do? Could I look at something real quick? I helped where I could, out of habit more than hope. But I could see where it was going long before they admitted it. The night they finally came to me, asking for help, wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No tears at first. Just my parents sitting in my living room, older than I remembered, hands folded, talking about foreclosure notices and stress and how they didn't sleep anymore. My mom said they were scared. My dad said they needed stability. Then he looked at me and said, "You've always been the responsible one." That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. I nodded. I listened. I made coffee. But inside, I felt the weight of every time I'd been told I was fine. I didn't need support. I'd land on my feet. Now, suddenly, my independence was being reframed as a resource they could draw from. A solution to a problem I'd warned them about years earlier. I told them I needed time to think. That was true. What I didn't say was that I'd already been thinking for a long time. About fairness. About boundaries. About what family actually means when responsibility only flows one way. A week later, while they waited for my answer, I got a call from my company. The promotion I'd been working toward for years was finally on the table. New city. More responsibility. A clean break. I didn't tell my parents right away. I let the silence stretch. Their calls became more frequent, more urgent. My mom started framing things differently, talking about sacrifices, about how families stick together when things get hard. My dad mentioned how much they'd done for me growing up. Each conversation added another layer of pressure, another reminder that my value, in their eyes, had always been tied to what I could carry for others. The night before I was supposed to give them an answer, my sister called me. Not to apologize. Not to take responsibility. She said she needed me to step up. That it was unfair for me to walk away when everyone else was struggling. She said, "You don't even need that promotion. You're already doing fine." I stared at my phone after she hung up, the words echoing in my head. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money or property. It was about a lifetime of being told my strength made me optional. I opened my email, reread the offer, and imagined what it would mean to finally choose myself. By the time my parents came over the next evening, their faces tight with expectation, I already knew what I was going to say. They came over the next evening with a tone that told me they thought the decision was already made. My mom brought a folder. My dad brought that familiar tight smile he used whenever he wanted to sound calm while steering a conversation in a specific direction. They sat on my couch like guests waiting for good news, not parents asking for help. Before I could even say anything, my mom started talking about timelines. How quickly the bank was moving. How if I stepped in now, everything could still be saved. She said it like it was a shared problem, like I had been part of the choices that led them here. I listened. That's important. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I let them explain the situation in full, all the way down to numbers and deadlines and worst-case scenarios. My dad talked about how embarrassed he was, how he never thought he'd be in this position. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "But that's why we raised you the way we did, so you could handle things like this." Something in my chest tightened at that sentence. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. They really believed this was the natural outcome of our family dynamic. That the reward for being responsible was inheriting everyone else's mess. When I finally spoke, I told them about the promotion. I didn't frame it as leverage. I just said it plainly. New role, different city, bigger commitment. My mom's face fell immediately. My dad leaned back like I'd physically pushed him. There was a long silence. And then my mom said, "So you're leaving now? When we need you?" I said I hadn't accepted yet, that it was an option, that I was weighing things. That part was true. What I didn't say was how their reaction had already tipped the scale. There was no congratulations, no pride, just disappointment, like my success was an inconvenience. That's when the conversation shifted. The tone changed. My mom started talking about everything they'd done for me growing up. The sacrifices, the roof over my head, the food on the table. My dad added stories about long hours he worked when I was a kid, like it was a debt ledger he'd been quietly keeping all these years. I'd heard versions of this before, but never this directly, never with this expectation attached to it. I reminded them, carefully, that they'd made their decision about the property years ago, that I hadn't been consulted, that I'd voiced concerns that were dismissed. My dad waved his hand and said that wasn't relevant anymore. Families adjust, he said. We didn't know things would turn out like this. That was the first moment I felt real anger rise up. Not explosive anger. The kind that's cold and steady and sharp. Because they had known. Maybe not the exact details, but the pattern. The risk. The imbalance. They just assumed it wouldn't land on them. And if it did, I'd be there to catch it. When I didn't immediately agree to help, my mom's voice got tighter. She asked what kind of son lets his parents lose their home. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just let the words hang there, heavy and loaded. I felt my jaw clench. I asked her, calmly, what kind of parents decide one child deserves security and the other deserves responsibility without a say? She looked genuinely confused by the question. That's what hurt the most. Not offended. Not defensive. Confused. Like the idea that the decision had been unfair had never occurred to her. They left that night without a resolution, but the pressure didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. My phone started buzzing constantly. Calls, texts, messages framed as updates, but really designed to build urgency. The bank called again. We might need to make a decision this week. Your sister is under a lot of stress. Every message carried the same unspoken assumption that I would step in eventually, that this was just a matter of timing. Marissa ramped things up too. She stopped pretending this was about shared responsibility and started treating it like an obligation. She showed up at my place unannounced one afternoon, pacing my living room like she owned it. She told me I was being dramatic, that everyone was struggling, that if roles were reversed, she'd help me. I almost laughed at that, but something in her tone stopped me. She believed it. She genuinely believed she'd do the same for me, despite years of evidence to the contrary. I asked her a simple question. If the property had been signed over to me, and I'd run it into the ground, would she be offering to cover the fallout? She didn't answer. She changed the subject. That was answer enough. The real breaking point came a week later, when my parents asked me to come over to talk things through. I walked into the old house and immediately noticed something was off. Papers spread across the dining table. Not just bank documents. Legal ones. My dad looked tired. My mom looked determined. They told me they'd spoken to an advisor, that there might be a way to restructure things, to transfer some responsibility. My stomach dropped before they even finished explaining. They wanted me to co-sign. Not temporarily. Not as a last resort. As a long-term solution. They framed it as a technicality, a way to reassure the bank. My name, my credit, my future, tied to a property I didn't own and decisions I didn't control. When I pointed that out, my dad said, "It's just on paper. You know we'd never let it affect you." That was the moment I realized how completely they misunderstood what they were asking. Or maybe they understood and just didn't care. Because when I said no, clearly and without hesitation, my mom's composure finally cracked. She accused me of abandoning the family, of choosing money over people, of punishing them for a decision they'd made with good intentions. I told her the truth then, that the decision hadn't just hurt me financially. It had taught me exactly where I stood, that being too self-sufficient to matter meant my needs were optional, my opinions disposable, my boundaries inconvenient. I said it quietly. I didn't raise my voice, but every word landed hard. That's when my dad said something I don't think he realized would change everything. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said, "If you'd needed help like your sister, things might have been different." There it was. The confirmation I didn't know I'd been waiting for. Not denial. Not justification. Confirmation. That my reliability had cost me a place at the table. That if I'd struggled more, failed louder, demanded attention, I might have been considered worth protecting. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. I told them I wasn't co-signing anything. I told them I wasn't stepping in to fix this. And I told them I was taking the promotion. My mom started crying then. Real tears, and for a second I almost wavered. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But then she said something that sealed it. She said, "I never thought you'd be this selfish." I looked around that house, at the walls I'd painted, the repairs I'd done, the weekends I'd given up, and I realized this was the story they'd always tell, no matter what I did. I left without another word. The fallout was immediate. Relatives started calling. Some were subtle, others weren't. I was told I was cold, calculating. That success had changed me. No one asked why I was the only one being asked to sacrifice. No one questioned the decisions that led here. They just wanted a solution, and I was the most convenient one. The night before I was supposed to give my final answer to my company, my dad called me alone. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said the bank had given them a final deadline. He said he didn't know what they were going to do. Then he said, "I thought you'd always be there." I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of that expectation settle fully on my shoulders. Not as love, as certainty. And as I stared at the email confirmation for my new role, one thought kept repeating in my head. If I give in now, this never ends. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was torn about the promotion, but because my entire understanding of my family had finally collapsed, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment that led there. Every favor, every dismissal, every time I'd been praised for being low maintenance, like it was a virtue instead of a warning label. By morning, the exhaustion settled into something heavier than sadness. It felt like grief, but not for the house or the money. I was grieving the version of my parents I thought I had. I accepted the promotion before sunrise. I didn't dramatize it. No long speech. No satisfaction. I just clicked the button, read the confirmation twice, and sat there staring at the wall while my coffee went cold. When the relief finally came, it wasn't the kind people talk about. It was quiet, almost numb, like stepping out of a building after a fire alarm and realizing you're still shaking even though you're safe. Telling my parents was harder than accepting the job, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew exactly how they'd hear it. I waited a few days, long enough for the bank's deadline to pass, long enough for the consequences to feel real. When I finally called, my mom didn't answer. My dad did. His voice sounded older, tired in a way that went beyond stress. I told him I was moving, that I'd accepted the role. There was a long silence. Then he said, "So that's it." Not a question, a conclusion. I said I loved them. I said I hoped things worked out. He said nothing else before hanging up. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. What followed was the worst stretch of my life, and not because I was struggling financially or professionally. On paper, I was doing better than ever. New city, bigger salary, more responsibility. But emotionally, I was hollow. I'd lost my anchor. The people who were supposed to be my constant had turned into something unpredictable and conditional. I went days without talking to anyone outside of work. I unpacked my apartment slowly, like I wasn't sure I deserved to settle in. The guilt hit me in waves. Late at night, early mornings, random moments at work when I'd catch myself zoning out. I wondered if I'd done the right thing. If maybe I should have helped just a little. If drawing a hard line had been cruel. That internal debate was relentless because it wasn't really about money or responsibility. It was about identity. For most of my life, I'd been the one who showed up. The fixer. The reliable one. Walking away felt like abandoning not just my parents, but a version of myself I'd spent decades becoming. Then the calls stopped. Not gradually. All at once. No more updates. No more pressure. Just silence. At first, it hurt. Then it scared me. Then it confused me. And finally, it clarified something I hadn't wanted to admit. They didn't miss me. They missed what I could provide. A few weeks later, I found out through a cousin that the foreclosure process had officially begun. The house was going to be listed. My parents were scrambling for temporary housing. Marissa had disappeared from the picture almost entirely, claiming she was overwhelmed and needed space. That part stung more than I expected. Not because I felt responsible, but because it confirmed exactly how alone my parents had been left by the person they'd bet everything on. I didn't reach out. That was a conscious choice, and one I had to recommit to every day. Because every instinct in me wanted to step in, to offer solutions, to smooth things over. That instinct didn't disappear just because I recognized it was unhealthy. It took effort to sit on my hands and let things unfold without me. Work became my refuge. Not in a dramatic, throw myself into it way, but in a grounding one. Clear expectations. Measurable outcomes. Feedback that wasn't tangled in emotional debt. For the first time in my life, I was being evaluated purely on performance, not on how much I could absorb for others. I thrived in that environment, and that scared me at first. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent managing family dynamics instead of investing in myself. The real low point came a few months in, when my mom showed up at my door unannounced. I hadn't given her the address. She must have gotten it from someone at work or through extended family. Seeing her standing there, smaller than I remembered, holding a suitcase she clearly hadn't packed properly, knocked the air out of me. She didn't apologize. She didn't accuse me either. She just said she needed somewhere to sit for a while. That the temporary arrangement they'd made had fallen through. That she didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I almost let her in without thinking. Years of reflex kicked in. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. She wasn't asking. She was assuming. I told her I couldn't. That my place wasn't set up for guests. That my schedule was demanding. All true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that letting her in would have reopened a door I'd just managed to close. Her face hardened immediately. She said she didn't raise me to be like this, that she never thought I'd turn my back on family when things got hard. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just said, quietly, that things had been hard for me for a long time too. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Then she left. I watched her walk down the hallway and disappear into the elevator, feeling like I'd just amputated something necessary to survive. That night, I hit what I can only describe as emotional rock bottom. Not despair, clarity without comfort. I realized that no amount of success would ever be enough to earn unconditional support from my parents. That the version of love they offered came with terms I could never fully satisfy. Accepting that hurt more than losing the house ever could. The rebuilding didn't start dramatically. There was no big revelation. It started with small things. Therapy, which I'd avoided for years because I didn't think my problems were serious enough. Long walks where I let my thoughts spiral without trying to fix them. Saying no to things at work that weren't my responsibility. Not because I couldn't handle them, but because I didn't need to. I started making friends who didn't know my family history. People who met me as I was, not as a role I'd filled. I learned how strange it felt to be cared about without being needed. It was uncomfortable at first. I kept waiting for the catch, but it never came. Slowly, my sense of self shifted. I stopped measuring my worth by how much chaos I could contain. I started noticing how calm my life was becoming, how my weekends were mine, how my decisions didn't need approval or justification. That calm felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, but it grew on me. The final shift came the day my dad called me again. Months had passed. His voice was different this time. Not demanding, not disappointed, just flat. He told me the house was officially gone, that they were staying with a distant relative for now. He said, "I guess you really meant it when you said you weren't stepping in." I said I had. There was another silence. Then he said something that surprised me. Not an apology, not remorse. Just, "I didn't think you'd choose yourself." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone in my lap, realizing that for the first time in my life, I had. And that choice had cost me more than I expected, but it had also given me something I'd never had before. The freedom to decide who I was without negotiating it with anyone else. I didn't know it yet, but that freedom was about to matter more than ever. The call with my dad lingered with me for weeks. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. No apology. No acknowledgement of the imbalance. Just quiet acceptance that the safety net they'd built for one child and denied the other had finally collapsed. And somehow, even then, I could tell they still didn't fully connect that outcome to their choices. To them, it was just bad luck. Circumstances. Timing. That's when I understood something fundamental. If I ever wanted them to truly grasp what they'd done, words would never be enough. They'd heard my concerns before and dismissed them. They'd heard my boundaries and tried to step over them. If there was going to be any reckoning, it would have to come from consequences they couldn't reframe or talk their way around. The opportunity didn't present itself right away. It never does. Life doesn't hand you neat revenge arcs with clear signposts. What it gave me instead were fragments. Small pieces of information that, on their own, didn't seem like much. But I've always been good at patterns, at noticing how things connect. It started with a voicemail from Marissa. I hadn't heard her voice in months, and hearing it again sent a jolt through me. She sounded frantic. Not dramatic frantic, the way she used to sound when she wanted sympathy. This was different. Tight. Controlled. She said she needed to talk to me. That it was important. That things were getting complicated. I didn't call her back right away. That alone was a new behavior for me. Old Elvis would have dropped everything. New Elvis listened to the message twice, noted what she didn't say, and waited. Over the next few days, more information filtered in through indirect channels. A cousin mentioned Marissa had been asking questions about liability. An aunt casually asked if I'd ever been listed on any family documents. A former family friend, someone who worked adjacent to local real estate, congratulated me on getting out when I did, then stopped talking abruptly when I asked what he meant. That's when I started digging. Quietly. Methodically. I didn't hire anyone at first. I didn't want this traced back to emotion or spite. I pulled public records, property filings, loan documents, anything that was accessible without crossing lines. And the deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Marissa hadn't just mismanaged the property. She'd leveraged it aggressively. Multiple loans, overlapping timelines, Clauses that transferred risk in ways my parents almost certainly didn't understand. And buried in the paperwork, repeated over and over, was a phrase that made my stomach drop. Personal guarantee contingent on familial support. They hadn't just assumed I'd help. In some cases, they'd implied it. Not legally binding, not directly, but enough to reassure lenders. Enough to paint a picture of a financially stable sibling who could step in if needed. I wasn't named, but I was referenced. The idea of me, the assumption of me. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Even after writing me out of their plans, they'd still built their future on my existence. That was the moment the plan stopped being abstract. I wasn't interested in humiliating them. I wasn't interested in yelling or public confrontations or dramatic reveals. What I wanted was something much simpler and much more devastating. I wanted them to be forced to live inside the reality they'd created without my presence cushioning it. The first step was distance. Not physical, but informational. I stopped responding to extended family inquiries entirely. No explanations. No defenses. Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people talk. Within weeks, I was hearing versions of the story that barely resembled the truth. That I'd abandoned my parents. That I'd chosen money over family. That I'd been cold. I let it spread, because the louder the narrative became, the more brittle it was. And brittle stories crack under pressure. The second step was documentation. I started keeping records of everything. Messages, voicemails, indirect requests for help, comments framed as jokes that weren't really jokes at all. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I knew from experience that memory gets selective when accountability shows up. Around this time, Marissa finally cornered me. She showed up at my office building, claiming she just happened to be in the area. We sat in a neutral space downstairs, surrounded by people who didn't know us. And for the first time in our lives, she didn't have the advantage of history or family sentiment. She didn't waste time. She told me things were worse than I thought. That our parents were struggling more than they were letting on. That creditors were asking questions. That my name had come up. I asked her calmly why. She hesitated. Then she said something that confirmed everything. She said, "They always told people you'd step in if things got really bad." I nodded like this was new information. Inside, everything clicked into place. I asked her one question. Did she ever plan to include me in the upside? If the property had succeeded, if the investments had paid off, would I have seen any of it? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "That's not fair. This isn't about that." But it was. It had always been. I told her I wasn't helping. Not now. Not later. And that if anyone contacted me again implying otherwise, I'd correct the record. Firmly. Publicly, if needed. Her face hardened, and for a moment I saw fear flash through the entitlement. Real fear. The kind that comes when a backup plan realizes it was never actually secured. After that conversation, the tone shifted across the board. My parents stopped asking for help and started talking about misunderstandings. About how maybe things had gotten out of hand. About how families make mistakes. The language softened, but the intent didn't. They weren't apologizing. They were repositioning. That's when I made my final decision about how this would play out. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't need them to suffer. What I needed was resolution. And resolution, I realized, wasn't going to come from confrontation. It was going to come from exposure. So I started preparing. I spoke to a lawyer. Not to sue. Not to threaten. Just to understand. To map out exactly where my obligations began and ended. To make sure there were no lingering ties. No assumptions that could be weaponized later. What I learned was reassuring and infuriating all at once. I was clean. Completely. Every attempt to link me to the fallout had been informal. Emotional. Assumptive. In other words, they had nothing on me. Except expectation. The last piece fell into place when my company announced an internal restructuring. A public-facing one. Press releases. Industry attention. My new role came with visibility I hadn't anticipated. Panels. Interviews. Features. The kind of professional credibility my parents used to brag about when it suited them. And suddenly, I realized the timing was perfect. Because when people who've rewritten the story about you are forced to watch the real version play out without their involvement, without their control, something interesting happens. They can't pretend anymore. Not to themselves. Not to others. I didn't know exactly how the final confrontation would unfold yet. I just knew I was done hiding. Done absorbing. Done being the invisible foundation everyone stood on without acknowledging. The The reckoning didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do, wrapped in timing and inevitability. By the time my parents realized what was happening, there was nothing left to argue about. The first public moment came sooner than expected. My company announced a major expansion initiative, and my role was featured prominently in the release. Industry blogs picked it up. A trade publication asked for an interview. A local business journal ran a profile that included my background, my career path, and a quote about independence and accountability that I hadn't even thought twice about when I said it. I talked about building stability through consistent choices, about not outsourcing responsibility, about learning when to step back and let people own the outcomes of their decisions. I didn't mention my family. I didn't have to. Someone else did that for me. An old family friend commented on one of the articles online, congratulating me and adding, "Your parents must be so proud." The reply chain that followed was educational. People who knew pieces of the story filled in gaps. Not maliciously, matter-of-factly. The house, the loans, the foreclosure, the fact that I hadn't been involved, that I'd moved on years earlier. By the time my mom called me that evening, the narrative had shifted beyond her control. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sounded stunned. She asked why I hadn't corrected people, why I'd let them think things that made her look bad. I told her, calmly, that I hadn't said anything at all, that I wasn't responsible for managing other people's assumptions anymore. There was a long pause, and then she said something I hadn't heard before. She said, "I didn't realize people would see it that way." That was the moment it finally hit her. Not because of my feelings, not because of fairness, but because the story they'd told themselves didn't hold up once it left the family bubble. When the same choices were viewed without emotional cushioning, they looked exactly like what they were. My dad tried a different approach. He called a few days later and asked to meet in person. Neutral place. Coffee shop. No audience. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to close the loop cleanly. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not broken, but stripped of certainty. We talked for a while about neutral things. The weather. The city. My job. Then he finally said what he'd come to say. He said they'd made mistakes, that they'd assumed I didn't need them, that they'd leaned too hard on the idea that I'd always be there. He didn't apologize directly, but he didn't deflect either. It was the closest he'd ever come to accountability. I listened. Then I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't hate them, but that I also wasn't coming back into the role they'd designed for me. That my life was stable now because it didn't revolve around cleaning up other people's choices. That stepping in now wouldn't fix anything. It would just restart the cycle. He asked if there was anything they could do. I said yes. I said they could stop telling people I'd abandoned them. Stop implying I'd promised things I hadn't. Stop framing my boundaries as punishment. I said if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one that didn't assume access to my time, money, or decisions. He nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing terms they didn't get to negotiate. Marissa didn't take it as well. When it became clear that I wasn't stepping in and that the extended family no longer viewed me as the villain, she unraveled publicly. She blamed the banks, the market, our parents, me. She told anyone who would listen that I'd changed. That success had made me cold. But something interesting happened. People started asking questions. Specific ones. About timelines. About decisions. About why she'd taken risks she couldn't back up. She stopped answering those questions. Eventually, she stopped showing up to family gatherings altogether. Last I heard, she'd moved again, chasing another opportunity, another reset. My parents followed a quieter path. Downsized. Adjusted. Learned, too late, what it meant to live without a safety net they'd assumed would always exist. The final moment came months later, on a random weekday afternoon. My mom sent me a message. Not asking for help, not asking for money, just a simple statement. She said, "I understand now why you stepped away." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I sent back one sentence. I didn't step away. I stopped holding everything up alone. We don't talk often now. When we do, it's different. Careful, limited, real in a way it never was before. There's grief in that distance, but there's also peace. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure for others. I no longer confuse being needed with being loved. The revenge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't involve confrontation or humiliation. It was simply this. I lived the life they'd always assumed I'd sacrifice, and I did it without them. And in doing so, I finally learned what independence actually means.